Tuesday, the last week of Jesus' life. The year is 33 AD, and it's the time where Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. Today we see that Jesus is the good news. Jesus is the gospel. Tuesday is the day that Jesus goes first down into the temple again to teach. Remember, yesterday he just turned all the tables over in this area. And you have to wonder, did they set them back up right after Jesus turned them over for Jesus to see them there the next day? Did they dare to do that? Well, Jesus goes into this temple, and now the Jewish leadership, if they weren't upset yesterday, they have some questions. They're stirring in their questions. They're trying to bait Jesus. They bring these questions to Jesus on this day that are kind of like those questions where, can God create a rock too big for him to carry? The questions where you try to trick someone in the question itself, where the answer would always be wrong. They're trying to corner Jesus. And so they start asking Jesus these questions. Jesus, who gave you authority? Where does authority come from? Jesus, is it lawful for us to pay taxes or not to the Roman government? Jesus, what does it mean if a man's wife dies? Or what is the greatest commandment? They're asking him all these questions. And then they ask the question, Jesus, what do you think about the Christ? And it's at this question where then Jesus stops them and he gives them these 7 woes. Because what he is seeing is he's seeing religious people who are acting religious on the outside, but on the inside, they are rejecting the one they claim to worship. We call it hypocrites. Jesus gives these woes, these warnings to these hypocrites. Hypocrites get under my skin. Those who say one thing and act a different way. And in some sense, we all have some of that in us. We're all tempted to say something better than we actually are, or to say we'll do something and never actually do it. We are all in that hypocritical camp, but oh man, hypocrites, they really get under our skin, and you can see they get under Jesus' skin. And this is why he gives these 7 woes to these religious leadership. This is what's happening on Tuesday. And it's at that point where he then goes to retreat to the Mount of Olives, where he retreats from this Jewish leadership who is trying to control their position in society. He retreats from the confrontations that he's getting with these questions, because these confrontations are the Jewish leadership trying to say, we want the financial insecurity of our Roman government. We like the idea, the Jewish leadership would say, where we can scratch the government's back and they will scratch ours in return. They like that concept. But then Jesus retreats. He comes back. And we kind of see why, because in Mark 14, verse 1, it says, "It was now 2 days before the Passover, the feast of the unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest Jesus by stealth." More than that, it says, and kill him. So we're seeing these angry religious leaders not just being upset and bitter. They are hating Jesus. They're at this point where murder, that was maybe off the question to begin with, but killing him is on the table. And they're planning in secret. They're like foxes trying to be tricky with their confrontation, but now with their plotting. So then Jesus retreats from teaching in the temple, and he goes to the Mount of Olives. Olivet Discourse is what we call it. And Jesus speaks with his disciples privately. So as we hit this day, Tuesday, in this Holy Week, Jesus comes and speaks to his disciples. So maybe we can listen to the words Jesus has for us today as he spoke to his disciples. Imagine yourself sitting with Jesus, close to the last days of his life, in his last week, and he wants to tell you something very significant. He wants to share with you something that will keep you faithful to him. Imagine that he's going to give you faithful words. And so what he does with the disciples is he shares with them tribulation and trial is coming. Rejection is coming, but there is hope. Like we said, Jesus is the good news. Jesus is the gospel. So what he shares with them is the hope of the promise of God is going to the nations, right? In Mark 13, verse 10, it says, the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. The gospel now, kind of in this midweek of Holy Week, is fulfilling the great promises of the Old Testament, the promises of Abraham, that this Jesus will bless all people. All the families of the earth will be blessed. So Jesus is retreating back, speaking to his disciples in this way. Would we listen with the importance that he's giving? Would we listen like we were a disciple sitting there saying, Jesus is the good news? Trials can come, hardships can come, temptations to try to get security from the world or finances from things around us can come. But let's look to Jesus as the gospel, his life, right? His death, his resurrection, his promises, his empowerment as our hope in the midst of hardship. Jesus is calling his disciples to believe. The hard thing about Tuesday, as it ends with confrontation as well, is that how it began in the temple. It ends with confrontation. It ends with hardship, but more in secret. This is the same day Judas Iscariot sneaks off and starts to talk to the Sanhedrin, where he makes a deal, exchanges his relationship with Jesus, the closeness he had with him, for some money. This is the night he's betrayed by Judas. Starts with confrontation and ends with this secret plotting. But in the middle of it, we're reminded that Jesus is the good news, that there are promises, that there are hopes beyond the confrontations of this world, beyond the betrayal that we see towards Jesus. There is hope in Jesus, though trials and temptations come. This Tuesday, would you reflect on Holy Week, that Jesus is the good news and gives us hope?